In our previous video, we were looking at challenges of having a small or family business. As we talk about challenges and decisions about starting up the business, let's look at the challenges of an Indigenous business. So we're looking at Indigenous businesses within Canada. And what creates the challenges for Indigenous businesses is the Indian Act of 1876. Under the Indian Act of 1876, any reserve land is owned by the federal government. This law was very paternalistic, and it was made in the best interest of the citizens of First Nations. The idea here is we don't trust you to make decisions for yourself, so we're going to do it for you. What that does for today's Indigenous people who live on reserves is that the land they're on is federally owned land. And so if you wanted to start a business on a reserve, there is you, the one who wants to use the land, there is the First Nations government, and there is a third party in the decision making, and that is the federal government under the Indigenous Northern Affairs Canada. So when people tend to start up businesses, right, they're getting a loan from a bank to fund the startup, or if it is a sole proprietorship, you might be using a personal loan. You're going to take a second mortgage to fund this idea that you have. Well, if you are an Indigenous person living on a reserve, the problem is that because the federal government owns the land, you cannot use it as collateral in loans. So it is very difficult for Indigenous people to get loans because there is no asset. If you can't pay back the bank wants something they can take. And so because there's no collateral there, it's very difficult for Indigenous people to get both personal loans and corporate loans. Because here the bank can't seize the land if the borrower fails to pay. So this can make it be difficult to start a business on the reserve. Come on. The other challenge with businesses as an Indigenous person is complicated tax laws and certainty in terms of knowing what the costs are to your business. So if you live on a reserve and you work on the reserve, then you are exempt. You don't have to pay sales tax, income tax, or property tax to the provincial or federal government. That is, if you're an Indigenous person recognized under the Indian Act. Now, there's been amendments to the Indian Act to incorporate other Indigenous people who were not originally recognized in the Indian Act, like Métis people. But that Indian Act continues to permeate through Canada. So if you have a business on the reserve, if you live on the reserve, you're not paying those taxes. Now, it's quite possible that your First Nation is collecting taxes, perhaps property taxes. Well, actually, the law says that First Nation groups can collect property and sales taxes to raise funds, but it's actually the federal government, provincial government who has to do it on their behalf. So again, Indian Act, we don't trust you to make decisions for yourself. We'll do it for you. So in that case, there can be taxes when you are on the reserve because the reserve needs utilities, right? When small towns outside the reserve need access to a dump, need access to water and electricity, they pay the bigger cities and towns around there to connect in. Same thing is true here. A reserve would pay a neighboring town or city for access in terms of water and sewage and all those things. Well, they need money for that. So First Nations groups can have property and sales taxes to pay for those services to those other cities. The government outside the reserve will collect it on their behalf. So it's not like there's no taxes if you're on the reserve. You may have those. But what complicates the matter is what if you are an Indigenous person living off the reserve? Or what if you are an Indigenous person who works off the reserve? Or what if you have a business on the reserve and your customers are non-status individuals? So status being recognized as Indigenous people under the Indian Act. Well, If your customers are non-status individuals, then you do need to charge them sales tax when you sell them goods or provide them services. If you are an individual who lives on the reserve and works off, then under the Williams test, you likely are not tax exempt. If you live off the reserve and work on, then under the Williams test, you likely are not tax exempt. But it's not extremely clear because the definition is activity for the use or benefit of Indians, Indigenous people recognized under the Indian Act. So this lack of clarity under the Williams test makes it really difficult to determine the actual cost implications and tax implications to Indigenous people, regardless of where they are, unless they are living on the reserve, working on the reserve, and not selling to people who are not part of that reserve. So this complication means that it's a bit more challenging to have an Indigenous business because it's really not clear where you actually sit in terms of some of these rules and laws. Some Indigenous businesses may choose to have a strategic alliance with businesses that are non-Indigenous. Why you might want to have an alliance, whether you're an Indigenous business or not, is for knowledge sharing, right? You connect with someone who has the expertise you don't. Maybe they have the technology you don't. Maybe they have access to the customers and markets you don't. Maybe they can help in terms of pooling resources, helping reduce some of the financial or political risk, helping you with your competitive advantage. So there's lots of motives to enter into alliances and joint ventures between businesses, between individuals, regardless if any of them are Indigenous businesses. If you are in a strategic alliance with an Indigenous business, it's important to recognize the impact of the paternalistic nature of the Indian Act. So as we stated before, the Indian Act really assumes that Indigenous people in Canada historically should not be given the rights to make their own decisions. The government should do it for them. They can't be trusted to make their own decisions. So in strategic alliance is very important as part of that partnership to recognize that impact that has had, and that these alliances cannot be where the non-Indigenous business is telling the Indigenous business what to do and is paternalistic in nature. You also need to recognize, as you're doing alliances with Indigenous businesses, that the Indian Act and the reserve system has created economic isolation for individuals. Because the Indian Act restricted who could leave the reserve, you had to have a pass. It restricted in terms of businesses being able to operate and economic growth happening on the reserve because, again, federal government owned the land. It's challenging to get the resources and connect with people and materials you need to get growth. That economic isolation has left an impact, a legacy on Indigenous people. And so a consideration as you're looking at your strategic alliances is in terms of that impact that's had. The other thing is to recognize that all businesses, in terms of our organizational structure, are really based on the decisions we make and our values and our beliefs. And so if you're partnering with an Indigenous business, recognizing that you may have differing worldviews. So our culture, our behavior, our attitudes all impact our organizational structure. We're going to talk about that in the next couple of videos. For the Indigenous people of Canada, which 5% of the population, 6,000 organizations within Canada, we need to understand then the worldview of Indigenous people, if we're working in Indigenous businesses, if we're partnering with Indigenous businesses. So we recognize that Indigenous people in Canada are not a monolith. They don't all feel the same way. They don't all believe the same things. There are different Indigenous organizations and in different areas. You can see them here. But we can talk a little bit in terms of Indigenous people's perspective, a bit more generally, as we are looking at how worldviews might differ. So the Indigenous perspective in terms of business and economics is a more holistic perspective. So if we go back to the medicine wheel, which is what you see here, and the medicine wheel is different between different Indigenous groups, the idea is a more holistic approach. That is, all decisions have an emotional aspect, a spiritual aspect, a physical aspect, and an intellectual aspect. And so it's about balance and it's about bigger picture. It's also about respect for all life. Indigenous businesses and economics isn't necessarily about gaining wealth and making money, but it's about developing relationships. The other thing we may see with Indigenous businesses is the role of that holistic view and that medicine wheel approach in management may determine when decisions are made. And so we may then have planning for the organization happen in the spring, and then training, then special projects, then more administrative decisions. So tying it here to that wheel, to the flow of time, right? Spring, summer, autumn, winter. You may also find within Indigenous organizations the way that groups and teams are constructed may be tied to this as well. As we look at the more visionary individuals, the more content knowledge-based individuals, the more analytical, and then the doers. We put all those pieces together in terms of building and constructing teams. So the views in terms of Indigenous culture are part of how Indigenous businesses operate, just like how any culture background, how we're raised, our values and beliefs impact businesses. So it's important to recognize that when you are part of a business that is based in a different culture than yours, whether it's Indigenous, whether you're working for an international organization or you're new to a country, in terms of how those values and beliefs really do influence the organizational structure and the decisions. So here we can see, if we were to do a comparison, here you can see more of that Western view, more colonial management approach, and here more of the Indigenous management approach. So the Indigenous management approach is really more in terms of group decision making, as well as involvement of an elder in terms of the organization, formality within the organization, inclusion in decisions, and a more holistic view of the employee. Whereas in a more Western, once you hit a certain age, you move on, you retire. There's not necessarily that elder involvement and that focus in terms of well-defined rules, jobs, defined duties, what the individual is expected to do, as opposed to the Indigenous perspective, which is the bigger picture, the greater group, and the balance among the team. So we get a number of these things from an individual named Brian Callio. He's a law professor at the University of Calgary who works in Aboriginal law and small business. And so what you're seeing here in terms of details come from a number of his works. And one thing I want to point out to you from his work is the idea of Indigenous management competencies. So in previous videos, we looked at the skills or characteristics of a successful manager. So when you look at this list, the ones that are not bold, you really have seen before, right? Strong communication skills, you're open-minded, you're problem-solving, you're a risk-taker, you're a moral leader, you're a visionary, and so on. We've seen those. What really gets added here as we look at the management of Indigenous businesses are the three that are in bold. The importance that the knowledge of culture and history, what has the experiences of the community, knowing that and using that to inform how the business operates is important. That idea of spiritual harmony and balance, that more holistic view, that recognition that decisions have a spiritual component to them, and then recognizing the strong Indigenous identity and maintaining that within the organization. So we add to the essential management skills, those additional pieces as we look at organizations that incorporate our Indigenous people and value our Indigenous perspectives. The last piece we want to look at here from Callio is the idea of wise practices. So often in management, we talk about best practices. What is the best way to do something? There's one right way to do something. Now, management in its evolution is moving further away from the idea of one right way. We're going to talk in the next couple weeks about some of that theory as we look at Taylor and the Industrial Revolution, where there really was this intent to find one right way to do things, the best way. Management today is more contextual. That is, the scenario dictates what you should do. And so as we look at Indigenous businesses and that Indigenous perspective on management, there really is an emphasis on the contextual, that there is no one best practice, but what Callio calls wise practices. So we recognize that there's not a standardization, but we do recognize that decisions should be based on a vision, a plan, that we need good governance, that we need leadership, that our institution, our organization should have some way to evaluate people's performances. There should be some accountability, and there should be a recognition of collaboration. And there's an important component here, which is the identity and the culture of the organization and the culture of the people who make up that organization.